The Hidden Diary of Mary Catherine Hensley. In 1987, a discovery that would forever haunt them was made by demolition workers tearing down an abandoned cabin deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Beneath rotting floorboards, a young woman's diary was found, revealing one of the most disturbing family secrets in American history. The diary belonged to a girl named Mary Catherine Hensley, and it meticulously documented 18 years of systematic psychological conditioning designed for one horrific purpose: preparing her to marry her own brother. This story remained buried for decades. The involved families vanished. The location was scrubbed from records. Even the workers who discovered the diary were paid to ensure they never spoke of it. But tonight, we are finally going to tell you about Mary Catherine Hensley, the girl raised from birth to become her brother's wife, and the nightmare that utterly consumed her entire existence. This is more than just a story about one family's depravity. It's about how a human being can be psychologically destroyed before they are old enough to even understand what is happening to them. Hello everyone. Before we begin, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep offering you stories just like this one. A lifetime of grooming. Mary Catherine Hensley was born on October 15, 1854, in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky. From the very moment she drew her first breath, every single aspect of her life was meticulously designed around one single, horrifying purpose. She was not raised as a daughter. She was not raised as a sister. She was raised as a future bride for her brother William, who was 2 years her senior and equally trapped in their family's twisted theology. The Hensley family had been practicing what they termed sacred marriages for 3 generations, convinced that preserving the purity of their bloodline was a divine commandment. Mary Catherine's grandfather, Jeremiah Hensley, had established their mountain compound in 1831 after fleeing Virginia under mysterious circumstances. He brought with him a distorted interpretation of biblical scripture that had convinced him that marrying outside the family was a sin against God, and that the highest form of spiritual purity could only be achieved through unions between siblings. Mary Catherine's diary, discovered over 130 years later, exposes a childhood that was essentially a prolonged grooming process disguised as normal family life. From the age of 3, she was taught that her brother William was special, that he had been chosen by God to be her husband, and that her sole purpose in life was to make herself worthy of him. She was never permitted to play with other children, was never exposed to normal family dynamics, and was never given any frame of reference for understanding that what her family planned was not just wrong, but monstrous. Her mother, Rebecca Hensley, spent hours every day conditioning Mary Catherine to accept her fate. She would read her stories about biblical marriages between relatives, teach her that love between siblings was the purest form of love possible, and constantly reinforce the idea that the outside world was full of corruption and sin that would destroy their family's holiness. By the age of 7, Mary Catherine was already planning her wedding to William, choosing names for the children she would have with him, and accepting a future that would destroy any normal person's capacity for healthy relationships. The psychological manipulation was so complete and systematic that Mary Catherine never underwent normal childhood development. She never formed an individual identity separate from her role as William's future wife. She never developed normal emotional boundaries or social skills. In every sense that matters, she was a victim of psychological abuse from the moment of her birth, shaped and molded to fulfill a purpose that would ultimately consume her entire life. The systematic destruction of a child's psyche. Mary Catherine's diary entries from ages 8 through 12 reveal the systematic destruction of a child's psyche in real time. Her family didn't simply tell her she would marry her brother. They successfully created an entire alternate reality where this was not only sacred but normal. Every day of her childhood was structured around reinforcing this delusion and eliminating any possibility that she might develop normal feelings about family relationships. Her father, Samuel Hensley, built a special room in their cabin that he called the preparation chamber, where Mary Catherine was required to spend 2 hours each morning learning to be a proper wife. In this room, she was taught domestic skills, but always within the context of serving William specifically. She learned to cook his favorite foods, to anticipate his needs and desires, and to mend his clothes. More disturbingly, she was taught to view his approval as the most important thing in her world, and his displeasure as a form of spiritual failure on her part. The diary reveals that Mary Catherine began having nightmares around age 9. But when she told her parents about dreams where she was running away from the mountain, they interpreted this as proof that she was being tempted by evil spirits. Their solution was to intensify her conditioning, adding evening sessions where she would kneel in front of a portrait of William and recite vows of devotion and submission. She was forced to write love letters to him, to practice conversations where she would express gratitude for being chosen as his wife, and to rehearse scenarios where she would comfort him during difficult times. By age 11, Mary Catherine was displaying signs of what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. She developed speech patterns that strangely mimicked her mother's voice when talking about William, suggesting she had so completely internalized the conditioning that she could no longer express her own thoughts about him. She began experiencing what she termed blank spells, periods where she would lose hours at a time and return to consciousness with no memory of what had transpired. Most disturbing of all, she started referring to herself in the third person when writing about her future marriage, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. The conditioning wasn't just psychological, it was physical as well. Mary Catherine was taught to groom and dress herself specifically to please William, to maintain a perfect appearance and posture at all times, and to view her own body not as something that belonged to her, but as something that existed solely for his pleasure and use. She was given detailed instruction about what would be expected of her on their wedding night, information that was entirely inappropriate for a child, but was presented as essential preparation for her sacred duty. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Mary Catherine's diary from this time is her complete lack of awareness that anything unusual was happening to her. She wrote about her preparation with the enthusiasm of a normal child writing about Christmas or a birthday party. She was genuinely excited about marrying William, truly grateful to her parents for arranging such a wonderful future for her, and genuinely convinced that she was the luckiest girl in the world. The brothers' obsession. William Hensley was not an innocent victim in this nightmare. He was an active participant who had been shaped by the same twisted family dynamics, but who reacted to the psychological pressure in dramatically different ways than his sister. While Mary Catherine internalized her conditioning and became the perfect victim, William externalized his trauma and became increasingly controlling, possessive, and violent as their planned wedding date approached. Mary Catherine's diary entries about her brother paint the picture of a young man taught from childhood that his sister was his property, and who developed an unhealthy obsession with controlling every aspect of her life. By the time he was 14, William was monitoring Mary Catherine's daily activities, demanding detailed reports about her feelings and thoughts, and punishing her whenever he perceived she wasn't devoted enough to their future marriage. The punishments William devised were both cruel and psychologically damaging. If Mary Catherine failed to express enough enthusiasm about their wedding plans, he would ignore her for days, leaving her confused and desperate about what she had done wrong. If she showed any interest in activities not directly related to preparing to be his wife, he would destroy her possessions and tell her she was being ungodly and selfish. Most disturbing of all, he began testing her loyalty by creating scenarios where she had to choose between his approval and her own comfort, always rewarding her for choosing his needs over her own. The diary reveals that William's behavior grew increasingly frightening and erratic as he entered adolescence. He would fly into violent rages if other family members paid too much attention to Mary Catherine, viewing any interaction she had with others as a threat to his exclusive claim on her. He began insisting that she ask his permission before leaving their cabin, before speaking to anyone else, and even before eating meals. By the time Mary Catherine was 13, she was essentially living as William's prisoner, though she had been so thoroughly conditioned that she interpreted his controlling behavior as proof of how much he loved her. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of William's behavior was his apparent enjoyment of Mary Catherine's psychological deterioration. As she grew more dependent on his approval and more terrified of disappointing him, he seemed to take pleasure in her desperation. He would deliberately withhold affection to watch her panic, then reward her with small gestures of kindness that left her pathetically grateful. He was actively creating a trauma bond that would make it impossible for her to imagine life without him, even as his presence in her life was destroying her mental health. The diary entries from this period also reveal that William was receiving his own form of conditioning from their father, who taught him that completely dominating Mary Catherine was not just his right, but his religious obligation. He was told that women were naturally weak and required strong guidance, that Mary Catherine's resistance to his control was evidence of spiritual corruption that needed to be beaten out of her, and that his role as her future husband required him to reshape her personality to perfectly fit his needs. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The wedding day and aftermath. On June 12, 1872, 17-year-old Mary Catherine Hensley married her 19-year-old brother, William, in a ceremony that represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of systematic psychological abuse. Her diary entries from the weeks leading up to the wedding reveal a young woman who was simultaneously excited about fulfilling her life's purpose and terrified by growing doubts she couldn't even fully articulate to herself. The wedding preparations took months and consumed the entire Hensley family. Mary Catherine was required to sew her own wedding dress, decorate the family's makeshift chapel with flowers she had grown specifically for the occasion, and prepare the food for the reception. Every detail of the ceremony was designed to reinforce the family's conviction that this union was blessed by God, that Mary Catherine was achieving the highest honor possible for a woman, and that their marriage would bring spiritual purity to the entire bloodline. But Mary Catherine's diary reveals that as the wedding neared, she began experiencing what she described as strange thoughts that made her question everything she had been taught. She wrote about dreams where she was living in a normal house with a normal family, about fantasies where she was married to a man she wasn't related to, and about growing confusion over why the idea of marrying William was starting to make her feel sick to her stomach. These thoughts terrified her, because she had been conditioned to believe that any doubts about her marriage were evidence of spiritual corruption. The wedding day itself was a grotesque parody of a normal ceremony. Mary Catherine walked down the aisle of their mountain chapel wearing a white dress she had sewn with her own hands and carrying flowers she had picked that morning, approaching a man who was simultaneously her brother, her rapist, and her future jailer. The ceremony was performed by their father, Samuel, who blended traditional wedding vows with bizarre religious justifications for what was happening, transforming one of humanity's most sacred rituals into an abomination. Mary Catherine's description of the ceremony reveals a young woman dissociating in real time, watching her own wedding as if it were happening to someone else. She wrote about feeling like she was floating above her body, watching this other girl marry her brother while she struggled to comprehend how this could be occurring. She described William's face during the ceremony as hungry and frightening, and noted that when he kissed her at the altar, she felt nothing but terror and revulsion. The wedding reception was attended by the entire extended Hensley family, all of whom had participated in similar marriages over the previous decades. Mary Catherine's diary describes relatives congratulating her on achieving her life's purpose, praising her for maintaining the family's purity, and expressing excitement about the children she would soon bear. She was surrounded by people who genuinely believed they were celebrating something beautiful and holy, while she grappled with the growing realization that she had just committed herself to a lifetime of horror. The wedding night was even worse than Mary Catherine had feared. Her diary entries from the following days are almost impossible to read without feeling physically sick as she describes being raped by her own brother while their parents listened from the next room. She had been prepared for this moment her entire life, but no amount of conditioning could have prepared her for the psychological trauma of being sexually violated by someone she had been taught to trust and love. The cycle continues. Within 8 months of her wedding, Mary Catherine was pregnant with the first of what would become 6 children, each one born into the same nightmare that had shaped her own life. Her diary entries during her pregnancies reveal a woman who was simultaneously excited about motherhood and terrified about bringing children into the world that had destroyed her own childhood. She knew on some level that her sons and daughters would be subjected to the same conditioning she had endured, but she had no power to protect them and no framework for understanding that protection was even necessary. Her first child, a son named Samuel after his grandfather, was born in March of 1873. Mary Catherine's diary entries about early motherhood reveal the complex psychological dynamics of a woman who had never been allowed to develop a normal sense of self trying to care for a child. She loved Samuel desperately, but she had been taught that her primary obligation was to William, not to her children. When William demanded that she choose between attending to his needs and caring for the baby, she was caught in an impossible situation that tore her apart emotionally. The pattern established with Samuel would continue with all of Mary Catherine's children. She would bond with them during infancy, but as they grew older and began developing their own personalities, William would assert control over their upbringing and force Mary Catherine to participate in their conditioning. She was required to tell her daughters that they were being raised to marry their brothers, to tell her sons that their sisters were their future wives, and to present this arrangement as desirable and normal. The psychological toll of participating in her own children's abuse was devastating for Mary Catherine. Her diary entries from the mid-1870s show a woman who was slowly losing her grip on reality as she was forced to repeat the cycle of conditioning that had destroyed her own life. She began having episodes where she would forget who her children were, referring to them by the names of her siblings, and becoming confused about which generation she belonged to. She would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that she was still a child herself, that her marriage to William had been a nightmare, and that she could still escape her family's compound. By the time her youngest child was born in 1879, Mary Catherine was showing signs of a complete psychological breakdown. She struggled to distinguish between past and present, between her own experiences and those of her children, and between reality and the elaborate fantasy world her family had created to justify their practices. Her diary entries became increasingly incoherent, mixing memories of her own childhood conditioning with observations about her children's development and paranoid fears about outsiders discovering their family's secrets. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Mary Catherine's motherhood was her complete inability to protect her children from the fate that awaited them. She could watch the same conditioning being applied to her daughters that had destroyed her own capacity for normal relationships, could see her sons being taught to view their sisters as property, and could do nothing to stop the cycle from continuing. She had been so thoroughly broken by her own experiences that she couldn't even imagine an alternative way of life, let alone fight for one. The final rebellion and death. As Mary Catherine entered her 30s, her diary reveals a woman who was beginning to understand in fragmented and incomplete ways that something fundamentally wrong with her life. She started having what she called clear moments, brief periods where the fog of conditioning would lift and she would see her situation with horrifying clarity. During these episodes, she would realize that marrying her brother was not normal, that her children were being damaged by their upbringing, and that her entire family was living in a nightmare disguised as religious devotion. These moments of clarity were torture for Mary Catherine, because they made her aware of what had been done to her without giving her any power to change her circumstances. She was trapped not just by family loyalty and geography, but by the complete absence of any framework for imagining a different kind of life. She had never seen a normal marriage, never witnessed healthy family relationships, and never been exposed to people who lived according to different rules. The brief glimpses of awareness only made her prison more apparent without providing any hope of escape. Mary Catherine's diary entries from the 1880s reveal a woman who was slowly planning some form of escape, though she couldn't articulate what that escape would look like or how she might achieve it. She began hiding small amounts of money and food, collecting information about the outside world from the few traders who occasionally visited their remote compound, and trying to prepare herself mentally for some undefined future where she and her children might be free from William's control. But every time Mary Catherine began to develop concrete plans for leaving, something would happen to reinforce her psychological bondage. William seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when she was pulling away from him emotionally, and he would respond by intensifying his control and reminding her of all the ways she was dependent on him. He would threaten to hurt their children if she ever tried to leave, remind her that she had no skills for surviving in the outside world, and convince her that no one else would ever want a woman who had been ruined by marrying her brother. The psychological warfare that William waged against Mary Catherine was sophisticated and relentless. He alternated between periods of relative kindness, where he would treat her almost like a normal husband, and periods of cruelty, where he would remind her that she was nothing more than his property. He would give her just enough hope to keep her emotionally invested in their relationship, then tear that hope away when she became too independent or confident. He was actively creating a trauma bond that made it impossible for her to imagine life without him, even as his presence in her life was slowly destroying her sanity. By the late 1880s, Mary Catherine's diary reveals a woman who had given up any hope of escape for herself, but was beginning to focus on protecting her children. She started teaching them small acts of rebellion, tiny ways of maintaining their individual personalities despite the family's efforts to reshape them. She would whisper stories about the outside world when William wasn't listening, encourage her daughters to think about what they wanted beyond marriage to their brothers, and try to plant seeds of doubt about their family's version of religious truth. Mary Catherine Hensley died on November 3, 1891, at the age of 37. The circumstances of her death revealed the final, tragic chapter of a life consumed by systematic abuse from birth. Her final diary entries, written in the weeks before her death, suggest that she had finally found the courage to confront William about their marriage and demand that he allow their children to have different lives. The confrontation ended with Mary Catherine's death under circumstances that were never properly investigated. William reported to local authorities that Mary Catherine had died suddenly of a fever, but her diary tells a different story. In her final entries, she described plans to take their children and flee the mountain compound, detailed conversations with sympathetic neighbors who had offered to help her escape, and a growing determination to break the cycle of abuse that had defined her family for generations. Her last entry, dated just 3 days before her death, expressed hope for the first time in decades and a determination to give her children the normal lives that had been stolen from her. The disappearance of Mary Catherine's children after her death suggests that William's response to her rebellion was swift and brutal. Within weeks of the funeral, all 6 children had been sent away to live with relatives in other states, and their names were removed from local records. William himself disappeared shortly afterward, abandoning the family compound and leaving no trace of where he had gone. It was as if the entire family had simply vanished, taking their secrets with them. A testimony to resilience. For over a century, Mary Catherine's story remained buried with her in that isolated mountain cemetery. The cabin where she had lived and died slowly rotted away. Her diary remained hidden beneath the floorboards where she had concealed it, and the outside world remained content in complete ignorance of the nightmare that had consumed her entire life. Local authorities showed no interest in investigating the suspicious circumstances of her death, and her extended family seemed relieved to pretend that she and her children had never existed. When that diary was finally discovered in 1987, the initial response from local officials was identical to their predecessor's reaction nearly a century earlier: bury the evidence and pretend it never happened. The construction workers who found Mary Catherine's journal were paid to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the diary itself was locked away in a state archive where it remained until a Freedom of Information request brought it to light in 2019. Mary Catherine's story serves as a stark reminder that the most horrific crimes often happen within families, hidden from outside view by institutional indifference, shame, and isolation. She was a victim of systematic psychological abuse from the moment she was born, groomed and conditioned to accept a fate that destroyed her capacity for normal human relationships and ultimately cost her life. Her diary, written in secret over the course of nearly 2 decades, stands as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit even under the most horrific circumstances, and as evidence that some family secrets are too terrible to remain buried forever. The mountain compound where Mary Catherine lived and died still exists, though it is now little more than a pile of rotting timber overgrown with weeds. But if you know where to look, you can still find her grave in the small family cemetery marked with a simple stone that identifies her only as beloved wife and mother. There's no mention of the brother she was forced to marry, no acknowledgement of the children who were taken from her, and no recognition of the woman who spent her entire life as a prisoner in her own family. She deserves better than that silence.